How are you, Paul? Great
Very
to
well.
be back.
Yes, it's nice to have you back in the studio. Well, you haven't been in here
more
for
than
4
a year
years.
since I've been here. And,
Yep.
And a while since we've had a yarn.
Yes, well, the last time you and I had a talk was 2 days before the 2007 election. You bought the travelling press pack, you and your wife Jeanette bought us a drink in far north Queensland.
You might say the last grog.
It was the...
Before we got booted out.
You were looking a bit glum at that stage.
Yeah,
I think you might have known
I'd seen
what
the
was...
latest opinion polls.
Well, you'd probably seen a few more polls than that, hadn't you?
Yeah. Look, we were up against it in 2007. The public had decided they wanted a change of government. We'd been there almost 12 years, and even though I didn't detect enormous hostility, there was just a feeling that they wanted a change, and of course they voted for a change. It's interesting to reflect on that because 4 years on, I don't think the public thinks the government they elected is better than the one they booted out, but anyway, that's democracy.
We'll get into that because that's the subject of your new chapter in Lazarus Rising, your very successful autobiography, which you've updated, which is the reason why you're here. Oh, that's interesting. Just a bit of breaking news. The ANZ has passed on the full 0.25% of the Reserve Bank's cut to the cash rate, so that's the first of the major banks to move.
Well, that's good news for people. I welcome it. I think everybody wanted it to happen, and I guess they took a bit of time, and I guess the other banks will do much the same thing. They may not do exactly the same thing. It's a bit more complicated than usual because the banks borrow a lot of their money from overseas, and it's so uncertain in Europe at the present time that there is a legitimate argument that the banks have to be very careful that they properly calculate their future funding costs. But I welcome the fact that they've done this, and this will probably mean that all the other banks will follow suit. Yes,
it'll be interesting to see what happens during the course of the day. You once said your aspiration for the average Australian was to be relaxed and comfortable. Are you relaxed and comfortable these days?
Yes, I'm very relaxed and comfortable. People often say to me, do you miss being Prime Minister? The honest answer to that is yes, I do. But the next question is, have you adjusted? And of course I have. And I enjoy life. I've got plenty to do. I do a lot of speaking on the international speech-making circuit. I help a few good causes in Sydney in particular, where I live. And of course I've spent a lot of energy writing this book, and I help the Liberal Party in different ways, unobtrusively. I think once you're out of it, you shouldn't become a sideline sniper. It's not fair. Tony Abbott's doing a good job, and I'll help him in different ways that I can, but I've got plenty to do, and I'm quite enjoying life. But the other thing is that I can look back on my time in office and feel that we achieved a great deal, and the Australian economy is still very strong by world standards. There's no doubt about that. Now, there are two major reasons for it. The first reason is that the former government, which I led, did leave the economy in very good condition, and that meant that when Australia entered the global financial crisis, we were able to withstand it better than most. And the other reason, of course, which is so apparent to Western Australians, is that the resources boom is enormously beneficial to this country, and we have the resources and the Chinese and the others have the appetite. And fortunately, Australians are reliable suppliers. We're very good miners. The skill and capacity of the mining industry is admired around the world. The Australian mining industry is admired around the world, and we do owe a lot to the mining industry, and that's a reason why we don't think it should be belted with new taxes. But that's really for the current political contestants to argue out.
I wanted to talk to you about the pros and cons of minority government. When you were looking down the barrel of what was going to happen, likely to happen in 2007, did you ever countenance the prospect that you might have been in a position where you had to run a minority government with the support of independents?
Quite briefly I did, yes. I didn't think it would end up that tight, although there was always the possibility. I thought about it briefly, but I don't think the Australian people will risk minority government again. I say in my book that at the next election it will vote very heavily one way or the other. At the moment the polls suggest it'll vote heavily for the coalition, but it's still 2 years for the next election, and we don't know what the mood will be towards the end of 2013. But I think the Australian public will be absolutely jack of minority government by the time of the next election. I think it will be a good election for the major parties. It will be a worse election for the Greens than was the 2010 election, and I think it will be a very difficult election for the two country independents, Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor.
And Mr Wilkie in Tasmania?
Well, Wilkie's a bit of a freak in a way, in electoral terms. I don't mean in personal terms, but in electoral terms, because he was elected in what has long been a Labor seat with the benefit of Liberal Party preferences. You say the Liberal Party regarded him as less worse than the Labor Party, so they gave their preferences to him. If that is repeated at the next election, he might still get back, but the possibility is that if the Labor Party is still in bad odour at the next election, Mr Wilkie will not get the second highest number of primary votes, and his preferences could well determine whether the seat is regained by the Labor Party or won by the Liberal Party.
You say in that new chapter, called The New Paradigm, you say Kevin Rudd's implosion continues to haunt federal politics. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that. I think the removal of Kevin Rudd continues to confuse a lot of Labor Party supporters. After 11 and a half years in opposition, the Labor Party finds a leader who wins an election for them after having tried 4 other leaders who failed, and then before he has a chance to put himself up for re-election, they knock him off. And they don't really give a policy reason for removing him. When Tony Abbott replaced Malcolm Turnbull as leader of the Liberal Party, there was a policy reason, because the majority of the Liberal Party no longer agreed with Malcolm Turnbull's position on climate change. And that was an orthodox, legitimate reason for changing leader. But there was never a policy explanation given. It was this odd sort of thing, oh, we've lost our way, which is code for saying that we were frightened that we would lose under Rudd and we're more likely to win under Gillard. Now, sure, Rudd's poll ratings went down, and he contributed to his own slump in the polls by changing his position on climate change quite dramatically, but it was confusing, and I still find in the community there's a feeling that she doesn't have a right to be there, because the Australian people voted for Rudd as the leader of the Labor Party. They voted for a Rudd Labor government. You see, in this country we don't have a presidential system, but governments are known by the names of the leaders they have. I mean, I led the Howard government, and people voted for me, and there is a difference, I've said, between authority and popularity. You can be very unpopular at various stages in your leadership, and I went through stages of unpopularity. Every leader does, but I always had the authority because I'd won elections. And people felt, well, he's still really in charge, and some of them thought, well, maybe he'll recover, maybe he won't. But I think she suffers that problem. And having participated in Rudd's premature removal and having failed to win the last election, she will struggle to have that authority as the years go by, as months go by, rather.
These clear tensions that exist between Julie Gillard and Kevin Rudd, do you think Australians just see that as similar to the tensions between you and Peter Costello, between Paul Keating and Bob Hawke, an extension of that?
Oh, no, they don't. Look, whatever differences may have existed from time to time between Peter Costello and me regarding the leadership and his understandable ambition at some time to become the leader, we never allowed it to interfere with the professional discharge of our duties. And you can't think of a single issue where Peter Costello was clearly pursuing one line very differently from the line I was pursuing. I mean, sure, we had different positions on the Republic, but that was a conscience fact. That was a different thing. But as far as the day-to-day management of the economy and the operation of things, Peter and I maintained, total professional harmony. And so did our two officers, and there was never any sort of undermining going on. Never happened, and I certainly saw never any evidence from him, and certainly had no reason to see any evidence from me of that occurring. And we were just determined to keep the government on a professional path. And I think for most of the time the same could be said of Keating and Hawke, although there were occasions when, particularly after Keating went to the back bench, where he took deliberately different stances from Hawke, which made life difficult for for the man he ultimately replaced, but it's nothing like the obvious rival. I mean, the way in which immediately after Barack Obama had been in, President Obama had been in Canberra and made that speech, and obviously Gillard was very much in the limelight. Kevin Rudd pops up on 7:30 making all sorts of statements, then he popped up on the eve of the conference advocating reforms, which of course he'd never advocated when he was Prime Minister, but that's by the by. I think that the tension in this Australia Network circus is just unbelievable, and obviously that has something to do with their rivalry as well.
Well, it's led to a completely perverse outcome.
Well, it's just such terrible process. When we were in government, we first gave the contract to the ABC, and then after a few years, it was up for renewal, and the Department of Foreign Affairs had a panel, and they had a submission from Sky and a submission from the ABC. They put their respective cases, and then Downer brought the recommendation to Cabinet, and he said, well, the panel recommends the ABC. And without going into too many details of the Cabinet discussion, there were a range of views around the table, but at the end of the day, he said, look, we've had a process, we've invited tenders, we can't really ignore it. And so therefore we said we'll give it to the ABC again. Now there would have been nothing wrong with the government having said right at the beginning, we have decided as a matter of government policy that this is something that should be run by the publicly funded broadcaster indefinitely, and we won't have a tender process. But once they committed themselves to a tender process, they were honour bound to follow due process and accept the recommendations of that tender unless there was some manifest error. And this malarkey about how, something leaked, therefore we've got to abandon the whole process, if you applied that to all the decisions of this government, they'd have no decisions, because most of them at some stage, and that applies to a lot of governments that are subject of leaks. I mean, do you abandon a budget because there's a leak? I mean, it's a ridiculous argument. Yeah.
Whole budget
budgets
leaks.
of mine, whole budget leaks.
leaks.
I could have suspended one in 1980. Yes, Mr. Oakes, yes.
Just rounding off that thing about Peter Costello, in your reflective moments now, do you ever think that maybe you should have stood aside for Costello during 2007 and things might have been different at the election, had you?
Oh, I think if there were to have been a change, it would have been in 2006, before Rudd became leader of the Labor Party, and I deal with the reasons why, particularly a very strong view inside my own party that I should stay, that didn't occur. You can't. The answer is I don't know. I mean, to your direct question, whether changing to Peter would have made a difference in 2007, we'll never know because it didn't happen. My suspicion is, my belief, rather, not a strong belief, but it's the best you can have in the circumstances because we're hypothesising, is that it wouldn't have made a difference because people tend to get tired of governments. And in Britain there was a change. Tony Blair had been Prime Minister during the whole time I was Prime Minister, and the Labor Party got rid of him in effect. I mean, he stood down, but they were obviously going to push him out, and installed Gordon
for
Brown.
His treasurer, yeah.
And he was replaced by Brown, and Brown lost. So that's my suspicion.
The ALP at the conference last week adopted offshore processing of asylum seekers. Do you find that mildly ironic, given the thrashing that you got from Julia Gillard?
I mean, this is the most extraordinary bungle of an important public policy issue. The boats had stopped in 2002, and we had the issue licked, and then gratuitously, despite having said before the election in 2007 that he would, quote, turn back the boats, Kevin Rudd unwound that policy. He's to blame for unwinding it, not Julia Gillard. She inherited the mess when she took over. And now, of course, we have a situation where, of course, Australia is seen as open. And what worries me most about this is that it will, in time, it will build in the community hostility to migration and refugees, which we had got rid of. One of the interesting things about our policy after 2002 was that public support for migration rose, and public acceptance of refugees was strengthened because people felt it was being run in an orderly fashion. And Australians are quite tolerant and open towards newcomers on the whole. I mean, there are some who are bigoted, but most Australians are very welcoming to newcomers to this country, and they know what a contribution migration made, but they want the program run in a very disciplined fashion. And when they see it descending into a shambles, which it has now done, they get very angry.
92211882. If you've got a question for former Prime Minister John Howard today, we'll take a break. Back with your